I started a new habit this last summer. The habit was, as I see areas, whether in my life or in someone else's, where God does something, whether it's a small thing or a big thing, I try to write it down. Now, by no means is my list of God working exhaustive. Absolutely, I am sure that I have missed the vast majority of how God has worked in my life. But I started trying to, on my phone, obviously you can't read it unless you have very good eyesight. But on here, I've got a list. This is from like the summer through the end of the year, and then I started a new one for 2024. I try to make an intentional effort to acknowledge when God does something, whether, again, it's in my life or the life of someone else. Early this morning, I came in and I was preparing, kind of getting ready for my message, and I had no idea how I was going to open our time. That happens sometimes. God, last minute, will say, all right, here's sort of where I want you to go, and here's how I want you to open this thing, and so on and so forth. I didn't get any of that this morning. So I walked in, and literally, we're in the middle of singing songs together, and I'm back there in the sound booth, and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm going to say when I stand up there, at least to start. Like, I got the rest of the message planned, don't worry, and I'm not going to ramble for 4 hours, I promise. But I had no idea how I was going to start. But then I opened this folder on my phone, this app on my phone, and I started to look at the way that God has worked in the lives of people around me. And I realized how beautifully it ties in to where we're going today. You see, the theme of where we're going today, or perhaps the most beautiful component of where we're going today, is God's, it's a church word, providence. Does anybody know what God's providence means? I'll explain it to you. Yep, there's one. God's providence is the way in which, by His grace, He guides history, slowly, methodically, using interactions with people to accomplish His end goal and His end purpose. In the same way that you see moments where God works in your life or in the lives of others, God has been at that work all throughout human history, taking an innocent, accidental meeting and turning that into a world-changing thing. Even our denomination is that. It was a man whose heart was for the lost, whose heart was for those that were marginalized by society. He simply follows what seems like a very innocent, very small call. And today, there are millions of people worshiping God that are a part of our denominational family, the Christian and Missionary Alliance today. God's providence guides all things to the good of those who are called according to His purposes. Romans 8:28. Today, we get the privilege of looking at a story where God's providence is on display. And I hope that it encourages you and reminds you that even in your life, even in the tragedies, even in the mundane, even in the joys, wherever it is that you land today, God is still at work. Let's pray together as we start. Lord, thank you for moving so powerfully in our lives, in the big moments and in the small ones, in the intentional moments and in the seemingly accidental. Lord, as we dive into your word this morning, I pray that the words that come from my mouth would be your words, would not be mine, but would be what you have to say. And I pray, Lord, for all of us that our hearts would be ready to receive what you have for us. Most of all, God, I pray that you would give us a view of who you are that is clear, that is accurate, and that causes our hearts to be warm to you in a way that perhaps is new. Thank you, God, for what you're doing in this place. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, I'm going to encourage you, if you have a Bible, to grab it and to turn to the book of Ruth. If you do not have a Bible with you, that is totally fine. You can follow along on the screens to my right and to my left. Before we dive in, though, just a couple of notes about what we're going to do and how we're going to approach today. Very simple day that I have in store for you in terms of the message. We have two sections. The first is we're going to walk through the entire story of the life of Ruth. Now, the way that we're going to do that is we're not going to read the entire thing word for word. We'll read sections, and then I'll fill in and summarize some sections. But as I have done in the past, and as I do from time to time, I want to encourage you, this is not a long portion of the Bible, okay? There are 4 chapters in the book of Ruth. It would take you 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes max, to read the whole thing. Although chapters and verses in the Bible are helpful, I do think in some ways they have taken us away from being able to see the big picture, to understand the whole story of what's happening. Ruth is not that long, but it is a gorgeous book. It is a rich book where we get to see the love of God on display. So I would encourage you, after this time, perhaps in your life group this week, take time and read the whole book. 15 minutes max. It's a good idea, or an idea that I certainly would encourage you to do. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the whole story, again, not reading every verse, summarizing parts of it. I'll make a few comments here and there about the context that I hope will be helpful. And then I'm going to just make some observations. I have 4 observations, and that's it. Observations about what God uses this moment in history for and how his providence really shines through. So, we're going to start in Ruth chapter 1. It's the 8th book of the Bible if you're trying to figure out where that is. Again, this is really storytelling back and forth, so it'll take up the majority of our time, but I'm excited about it. So let's just dive right in. Ruth chapter 1, starting in verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and his 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And when they reached Moab, they settled there. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left alone with her 2 sons. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, the other married a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. This left Naomi alone without her 2 sons or her husband. A couple of brief comments, and then we're going to get right back into the story. First, the text says that this is during the time of the judges. Pastor Peter last week preached a great sermon overviewing the themes of the book of Judges. And a couple comments about that. One, the book centers on a time when there was no primary leader in Israel. And the book tells us that everybody did what was right in their own eyes. That feels a little bit like culture today. Just do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Find your own truth. That was very much the time of the judges. But the problem with that, and the problem that Peter so beautifully illustrated for us, is that it does not go well when humans, when you and I, are left to our own devices. And there was this cycle of rebellion in humans. God raises up a leader, by the way, an imperfect leader. He rescues the people, but then they rebel again. And then there's an even worse leader that comes up. And so the book of Judges is this commentary about humanity without God's direct leadership. And it's brutal, and it's gory, and it's gruesome. And if you want to talk about a rated R book in the Bible, it's the book of Judges. This story, as beautiful as it is set during that time, during the time of the judges. Now, we're introduced to this character, Elimelech, and his family, Naomi, his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Because of a famine, they go to the land of Moab. A brief comment there. The Moabites and the Israelites do not get along. They are distant cousins that fight and hate each other deeply, to the point that, actually, there's a spot in the Old Testament where it says that the Moabites are not allowed into the temple to worship God. They hate each other, okay? But that's an important theme as we navigate through this book together. Elimelech, because of a famine, chooses to take his family to the land of Moab. While there, he dies. His sons marry. 10 years go by, and both of his sons die, leaving his wife Naomi and his 2 daughters-in-law. Now, let's continue through the story. I'm going to summarize the next block of verses for us. The conditions in Israel get better. That's positive, okay? Naomi then decides to go back to Israel. She has no tie left to the land of Moab. She wants to be back with her people. She tells her daughters-in-law, though, to go back to Moab. You see, the thing is because the daughters-in-law are not Israelite, she, out of love, says, it's not going to go well for you as a foreign widow in the land of Israel. You should try to go back home, build a life for yourself back there. One of the 2 daughter-in-laws says yes, that's Orpah. But Ruth does something very, very different. We see it in verse 16. She replies, don't ask me to leave you and to turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. And this is one of the most beautiful statements of loyalty between humans in the entire Bible. Here's a woman who's an outsider, who has no husband, going into the fire, and she says, I am not going to leave you. There's nothing you can do. May God punish me if I fall away from my obligation to you. One of the most beautiful passages in the text. Verse 18 through 20, they get back. People recognize Naomi. It's only been about 10 years that she has been gone. But rather than calling her Naomi, she requests that people call her by the name Bitter. Could you imagine that? Your life is so bad that you're like, my name is no longer Jeff. Just call me bitterness. Call me anger. Call me rejected by God. Not a great nickname, by the way. But honestly, who can blame her? In fact, she says in verse 21, I went away full from Israel to Moab, but the Lord has brought me home empty. And at the end of chapter 1, we have this tragic setting of a woman who's lost everything, who has no joy, no hope. And we start to ask some pretty challenging questions. Where's God? Where's the love of God? Where's the providence of God here? And this is not an uncommon question that I have heard in our day. You have a hard life, things go poorly, and you start to easily ask questions. God, where are you? God, why are you allowing this suffering? God, I didn't sign up for this. I thought that when I said yes to you, when I chose to follow you, my life was going to be easy. But God never promises that. And for Naomi in particular, the setting is bleak. Now, we jump then into chapter 2, and we're about to get introduced to someone who plays a very important part in the story. Verse 1. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. That's a significant detail that he's related to Elimelech. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. Verses 2 through 6. Ruth, trying to figure out how they're going to make a living, they're poor, they're widows, Ruth and Naomi are, decides to go pick leftover stalks in a field. A brief comment about this: in Israelite culture, the Bible actually tells the Israelites that when you pick your grain, you're not supposed to completely clean out your field. If something falls to the ground, you're meant to leave it there. And you're meant to leave it there so that those who are poor, those who don't have enough, can come behind you and glean or take the remaining wheat or barley in this case, off the ground, take it home, process it, and make it into bread so that the poor among you can survive. It's actually a beautiful command by God to love the poor around them. In the process of following that, Ruth goes out to pick those leftover stalks. She happens, sounds like an accident, pretty sure it's not. She happens to land on Boaz's field, who takes notice of her, sees how hard she's working, and then he asks about Ruth. And he's told about who Ruth is. This is the daughter-in-law of Naomi who didn't go back to her homeland, but chose to stay with her mother-in-law. Of course, immediately that's an impressive thing to Boaz. Boaz then responds. He goes up to her, and he says in verses 8 and 9, "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us. And when you gather grain, don't go to any other field. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See what part of the field they are harvesting, and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." Tremendous generosity from Boaz, very directly to a foreign widow with nothing. But pretty cool. Pretty cool to see this happening. Again, I know I'm going quickly, but I want to give you the whole story. Verses 10 and 11, Ruth is blown away by his kindness, and he then responds admiring her, recognizing that, again, this is the woman who stuck it out with Naomi. Generosity and beauty and compassion for each other is just flowing all around. Boaz says in verse 12, "May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you for what you have done." The day ends. Ruth has collected a full basket of barley. And then she tells Naomi about her day and about her interaction with Boaz. Now, this is where the story starts to take a very interesting twist, okay? And there's a significant thing that happens, also something commanded by God. And we're going to see that right here. Verse 20. "May the Lord bless him," Naomi told her daughter-in-law. "He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband." That's a weird statement, but she explains it. "That man is one of our closest relatives and one of our family redeemers." This is the coolest part of the story, at least from what we've seen so far. In Israelite culture, and this was also given by God, if a widow had no one in her family, no men particularly, and this is not about men or women, it's just it was very difficult to survive if you were a woman on your own in the ancient world. A family redeemer, a close relative of your dead husband, could come in, could purchase the dead husband's land at a very inexpensive price, could marry you, and then could have children with you, both protecting you as the widow, as well as your family line, which is such a cool way that God chose to help protect the Israelite people. And so when we talk about a family redeemer, we start to get in our mind this idea that maybe God is going to do something in this story to help restore the line of Naomi, this woman who's had this tragic, tragic story. Then we get to chapter 3. I'm going to read verses 1 through 6. "One day Naomi said to Ruth, 'My daughter, it's time that I found a permanent home for you, so that you will be provided for.'" Again, the generosity back and forth between Naomi and Ruth is tremendous. "Boaz is a close relative of ours, and he's been very kind by letting you gather grain with his young women. Tonight, he will be winnowing barley at the threshing floor. Now do as I tell you. Take a bath and put on perfume and dress in your nicest clothes." This is contrasted with the clothes that she likely would have been wearing of mourning. She's just lost her husband. But what Naomi is saying is, Ruth, you need to let him know that you are available. Dress in your nicest clothes, put on perfume, something is going to happen. Back to verse 3. Then go to the threshing floor, but don't let Boaz see you until he has finished eating and drinking. Be sure to notice where he lies down, then go and uncover his feet and lie down there, and he will tell you what to do. And then Ruth responds with submissiveness. I will do everything you say, Ruth replied. So she went down to the threshing floor that night and followed the instructions of her mother-in-law. Next couple of verses, things play out exactly the way that Naomi says. Boaz falls asleep, just as the plan was, and Ruth does exactly as she was told. Verse 9, Boaz is startled, wakes up. Who are you? He asked. I am your servant Ruth, she replied. Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer. This is a weird thing, like cover over me? It doesn't seem to make sense. What she's saying is, I'm a widow. Naomi, my mother-in-law, has no prospect of anything happening good for her in the future. By cover over me, it means marry me, take up the role of this family redeemer so that our family might continue on beyond just my mother-in-law. She basically proposes to him. Boaz praises her virtue. He says he's willing to marry her, but there's an issue. There's another redeemer that might be closer. He says he's going to deal with that in the morning. She wakes up that next morning. She leaves early so that no one else sees her. Boaz, again showing generosity, gives 6 scoops of barley to her to take back to her mother. She goes back to Naomi and tells her all that's happened. And then we get to the last chapter of the book. We're almost done. Really cool story so far. Verse 1 of chapter 4. Boaz went to the town gate and and took a seat there. Just then the family redeemer he had mentioned came by. So Boaz called out to him, "Come over here and sit down, friend. I want to talk to you." And so they sat together. The men discuss redeeming Elimelech's land. At the beginning, the other redeemer says, "Yeah, that sounds great. I will do that." But Boaz says it also comes with Ruth, who is this outsider, who is this Moabite woman. And the closer redeemer says, if that's the deal, I'm not interested. He doesn't want to marry someone who is not Israelite, which is understandable to some degree in that culture. But Boaz has seen the quality and the virtue and the loyalty of Ruth. And so Boaz agrees to redeem the land and marry Ruth in front of all of the elders of the town. They seal the contract, and they do it in the very normal way that you and I certainly do it, which is they trade shoes. That's actually what they do. They give a sandal and take a sandal. We don't actually do that. But that would make mortgages a lot easier, wouldn't it? All that paperwork, it's like, here you go, whoop. Whatever, anyways. But what if it doesn't fit? I don't know, it's just a whole deal, just a whole thing. Verse 13 and 14. So Boaz took Ruth into his home, and she became his wife. When he slept with her, the Lord enabled her to become pregnant, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women of the town said to Naomi, "Praise the Lord, who has now provided a redeemer for your family. May this child become famous in Israel." And then the most potent and beautiful verse in the entire story, the neighbor women said, this is verse 17, "Now at last Naomi has a son again." This woman who had this tragic stripping away of everything now has been given a child again. And this child, by the way, is no ordinary child. We find out at the very end of the text that Obed, the child of Boaz and Ruth, becomes the grandfather of the greatest king in Israel, David, who, by the way, is in the line of Jesus. And so a Moabite woman, virtuous Moabite woman, becomes one of the great, and so on, grandmothers of the Messiah. And the book ends. And we get this beautiful, fresh taste of something lovely in a time in history when there's just not a lot of lovely in Israel. Now, 4 really brief observations to the story, okay? First observation, is the timing. And I mentioned this just a second ago, but this is during the time of the judges, right? It's gruesome and it's ugly, and yet there's this microcosm of a story of beauty and of God working and of things moving the way that they should. I don't think it would take a lot of convincing from here, from me to you, to say that the world we live in is a disaster. Yes? That it's a mess. That there's war on several continents. That there is all kinds of sin. That there are people that do what seems right in their own eyes. And yet in the middle of it is this steady, consistent statement that God is not yet done, that He is working. And so as bad as it is out there, God has not lost control of the world that you and I live in. That on its own doesn't make all of the evil go away, and I get that. That doesn't remove all of the concern and all the worry. I understand that too. But how lovely is God that He has not stopped working. That the providence of God is still continuing. We can take a lot of hope in that. A lot of hope in that. A second observation. The law, or God's way, works. There are three very specific things in this text that are commanded by God to the Jewish people, to the Israelites in the Old Testament. One of them is to be kind and to be generous. We see that all over the place with Ruth and Boaz, Naomi. They're all looking out for one another, choosing humility, choosing to love others well. We see the family redeemer at play. A family that isn't lost or forgotten, but is redeemed, brought back into the fold of the people of Israel. And we see a gathering of the grain by the poor, that even though Ruth was down and out and was marginalized, she still was provided for. The principle here is that God's way works. So what does that mean for you and me? Well, I recognize that it can feel prohibitive or restrictive to follow the Bible, to do what it says, to live according to its design, right? To be kind to others, to be humble, to wait until marriage, to do all these other things. I recognize it can feel restrictive. But the beauty is that God's way just works. And this is an element of that. That when we engage in the way that God has told us to live, things tend to go better. Now, why is that? Maybe because God made you. Maybe because He designed every element of you and every person you've ever met. Maybe it's because He knows every single hair on the top of your head. Maybe it's because He understands the inner workings of culture and society, because He's the one that built them. And so when we follow God's way, it doesn't mean it's always going to work out exactly the way we want to. There was certainly tragedy in this story. But in the end, God does amazing things when we follow His way. Third observation, God's plan is moving forward. Two different ways in which this happens. Naomi gets exactly what she needs. She starts in tragedy. Seems like an accidental meeting between Ruth and Boaz. Certainly, I don't think it was an accident. God's providence at work there. Naomi gets exactly what she needs at the end of the story, and we have almost this symmetry. She loses in chapter 1, she gains in chapter 4. Beautiful story. But even more than that, at the end of the book of Judges, there is a very direct statement that a king is needed in Israel. The very next story is God working out the grandfather of the greatest king in Israel's history. God's plan is still moving forward. And the point there is Romans 8:28, that we know in all things God works for the good of those who love Him and who are called according to His purposes. That means that no matter what hardship, pain, question, unknown, lack of clarity you have experienced in life, God's still at work. And He has a plan for you. It may not be the plan that you have for you. It might have some detours. It might have some tears. It might have some anger. But God is in charge, and He's still moving according to His plan. You don't ever have to lay your head down at night and say, is God actually doing anything? Because He is. And then finally, Ruth represents the story of Jesus. The book of Ruth is actually only 85 verses. 85 verses. Again, you can read it in 15 minutes. The word redeemed is in that book 23 times. Redemption is the idea of purchasing out of hopelessness. Naomi was hopeless. Through Ruth's kindness, she's brought out, at least partially, from this hopelessness. Through Boaz's generosity, she's brought fully out. And that is where you and I stand if we're Christ followers. And so I know it seems like, oh, we're talking about the gospel again? Yes. Why? Because the gospel is the most important thing to you and to me as people that are choosing to try to follow God. It's the gospel. It's that you were hopeless, that you were a tragic story, but God. But God. That He stepped in when no one else could. That He did the very thing as both God and man, living a perfect life, completely satisfying every rule, every requirement given to humans that we couldn't. That He lived a perfect life, that He died a sacrificial death in your place so that you, before God, look clean, so that you are redeemed if you choose to follow Him. And so that's the book of Ruth, a beautiful book, rich with meaning, rich with implication for us, that we can see the providence of God, and we can also see a precursor to the coming of the Messiah. So I think you should go and read it. I think you should learn it, and I think you should understand it, and I think you should see how beautiful and how rich God is in it. And how awesome is God that He continues to lead us that way. Lord, I thank You for